Kenny G is swinging. You can't tell me otherwise.
Sometimes you say the word jazz and people think of some of the worst music on earth, like, for instance, Kenny G. I mean,
that's a hard lick, and I just played it really well.
So if I were to ask you, who is the most famous jazz saxophonist? There's a good chance that you're going to say John Coltrane. And that's a good answer. And if you're really into bebop, you might say Charlie Parker. But if you're like the majority of people who are not familiar with the jazz idiom, there's a good chance that you're going to say Kenny G. And on the surface, this response makes a lot of sense. It's not inherently wrong, right? Because while Charlie Parker sold 100,000 albums and John Coltrane sold over 2.8 million albums across the United States and Europe, Kenny G, that man sold 75 million albums and he's still kicking. So Kenny G is undoubtedly the top-selling instrumentalist, top-selling saxophonist of all time. The question becomes less of, is Kenny G the most famous saxophonist of all time, but instead, is Kenny G and the music that he plays considered jazz? Those of you who aren't familiar with the jazz culture would probably see this as a dumb question because Kenny G is like the face of smooth jazz. And if he's the face of smooth jazz and smooth jazz is a subgenre of jazz, then he has to be the most famous jazz musician, right? I mean, how could something that's labeled as a genre not be under the classification of that genre? Unless, of course, you're saying that smooth jazz is a misnomer. And this is the impetus of the great divide amongst jazz musicians and jazz fans. What is jazz? A couple years ago, this conversation was levied towards the artist Leve, where jazz musicians were critiquing her as being branded as the savior of modern jazz. This, of course, wasn't a label that she put on herself, but was rather one that was placed upon her by journalists trying to gain clicks. Nevertheless, this caused her music to be put under an exorbitant amount of scrutiny. And while her music is definitely inspired by jazz artists such as Chet Baker, Frank Sinatra, she's often compared to mid-century pop, which has a lot of overlap in the jazz genre. Her music has a modern pop bossa nova influence, but also contains things that are very idiomatic of jazz standards. But at the end of the day, the biggest criticism comes from two areas. One, is she swinging? And two, is she improvising? Wynton Marsalis defines jazz as having three things: swing, collective improvisation, and blues language. Obviously, as Adam Neely pointed out, this is not a holistic view of what can be considered jazz, because a genre like bluegrass exhausts these three categories. It has swing, it has blues, and it has collective improvisation. Most of the time, if you ask anybody in good faith what is bluegrass, they're gonna see it as its own genre developed by a whole different set of people and has its own set of like ideas and standards. Therefore, there has to be something outside of this Aristotelian view of classification that makes something more or less jazz. Also, there are works in the jazz genre that don't have all three of these elements. For example, the solo sessions by Bill Evans. Those don't have collective improvisation because he's the only person improvising. Then we can look at the entire subgenre of like Latin jazz and bossa nova. Doesn't have swing. And then if you look at modern jazz, especially the way that these modern saxophone players, no tea, no shade, are playing, there's no blues influence, right? It's just chromatic pentatonic lines that are replaying at 300 beats per minute so no trumpet players can keep up. Nevertheless, all of these things are widely considered to be under the jazz umbrella. So why is smooth jazz any different? And that's kind of the crux of the argument, right? Kenny G is not a jazz musician because he plays smooth jazz, and smooth jazz is not jazz. Therefore, Kenny G is not a jazz musician. So let's unpack that claim of smooth jazz is not jazz. I'm gonna have to read for a second. Smooth jazz can be defined as an outgrowth of fusion, one that emphasizes its polished side. Generally, smooth jazz relies on rhythms and grooves instead of improvisation. There are layers of synthesizers, light funk rhythms, light funk bass, electric guitars, and either trumpet, alto, or soprano saxophones. The music isn't cerebral like hard bop, nor is it gritty and funky like soul jazz or groove. It is unobstructive, slick, and highly polished, where the overall sound matters more than the individual parts. And it's in this definition of smooth jazz where we see the disconnect between jazz purists and smooth jazz defenders. Jazz fusion, which arose in the late 1960s, was on a trajectory where it was pushing the boundaries of what could and could not be considered jazz, right? They were exploring sounds with synthesizers, electronic instruments, processing, in order to see where they can push the jazz idiom. But by the mid-70s, this change became more radical for the average consumer. They yearned for something simpler, something easier to listen to, something smoother. Songs like Mr. Magic by Grover Washington Jr. and Feel So Good by Chuck Mangione became hit successes, and radio stations saw the demand for what would be considered instrumental R&B. And in some ways, the development of smooth jazz was the antithesis of the development of bebop, where bebop was a movement led by musicians really trying to get on the cutting edge of what this music could be, and smooth jazz was led by capitalists really trying to get on the cutting edge of where they could make money. But in all fairness, I think that this view is a bit reductive because it puts musicians in two categories: jazz musicians and non-jazz musicians. But if you look into the history of how music is made, and if you're on the scene at all, you'll realize that jazz musicians and non-jazz musicians have quite a bit of overlap. For example, Chuck Mangione, one of the musicians who pioneered the smooth jazz genre with his song Feel So Good in 1977, studied at the Eastman School of Music, and he played with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. So it would be a ridiculous assertion to claim that he himself is not part of the jazz idiom, despite being a prolific smooth jazz artist. Some other smooth jazz pioneers include Wes Montgomery, George Benson, Bob James, Al Jarreau. And these are all people that any reasonable observer would classify as being jazz musicians. The biggest distinction between smooth jazz in the late 1970s and jazz fusion was the tempo, complexity, and the resonance with audiences. But these distinctions are not unique to these two genres. In fact, they're the same distinctions that separated the swing movement and the bebop movement. Even if radio stations were pushing smooth jazz more than they were pushing jazz fusion at the time, does that make it any less jazz? Especially when the musicians involved in the creation and the production of the music were jazz artists. So by any metric of analysis, smooth jazz should be considered as part of the larger family tree of jazz. So conclusion is, smooth jazz is jazz. But don't take my word for it. What does Wynton Marsalis have to say?
Actually, it is called jazz. I don't like it. It doesn't matter. It is called jazz. That is a fact. There are jazz festivals all over the world. And Kenny G is a jazz musician in relation to what is considered to be jazz now. He plays jazz. He improvises. He knows tunes. He plays on changes. So it is called jazz.
Now we have to ask ourselves, why do people hate Kenny G?
Man, what did he do to make them that mad?
And I think it's for a couple reasons. Aside from the general frustration with the assertion that smooth jazz belongs in the jazz idiom, Kenny G exhibits some traits that are looked down in the broader jazz scene. He certainly has committed some faux pas throughout career. The first is that he doesn't seem to be all that interested in jazz music outside of the smooth jazz subgenre. He talks ad nauseum about how much he loves his own saxophone sound. And while he does say that he has to get better, he doesn't ever really mention who he looks up to outside of maybe Grover Washington Jr.
That's a hard lick, and I just played it really well.
Well, I've never taken any music lessons, so I don't really know exactly what I'm doing.
I had a lesson every week. I remember the guy's name, Mr. Bloom. I mean, I haven't thought about him for 40 years, but he was the one that taught me the mechanics of how a saxophone works.
And unlike Chuck Mangione, who played with jazz giants like Art Blakey and the like, Kenny G often spends his time in the realm of pop stars and R&B legends. So while you may see him playing with Stevie Wonder, you're probably not going to see him playing with Lincoln Center. And with the massive success that he's gained as being the face of jazz for so long, at least the face of smooth jazz, he's done very little to expand the realm of jazz education specifically. Instead, he spends his time promoting music education broadly, which is still a great act of philanthropy, but it does show that his alliance is less with jazz as an art form and more so music in general, which makes arguing for Kenny G being a jazz musician kind of difficult because he doesn't really seem to care about being a jazz musician. That is, except for that one time. Kenny G once covered Louis Armstrong's version of What a Wonderful World. And I say the word covered loosely because it was kind of just a version of him playing over Louis Armstrong's version of What a Wonderful World. Now this pissed off Pat Metheny, and I'll leave a link to the full quote, but here's a little excerpt.
Sometimes you say the word jazz and people think of some of the worst music on earth, like for instance Kenny G. I mean, you know, there's nothing more stupid than that. Let's face it, that's the dumbest music there ever could possibly be in the history of human beings.
Clearly, Pat Metheny does not really favor Kenny G's playing. And this is a sentiment carried by many jazz musicians, especially working jazz musicians, where they say that he's not playing to the standard that a working professional jazz musician should be playing at, especially a working professional jazz saxophonist. And again, I think I kind of have to disagree. Now, I don't know about the time of that particular recording. Maybe that was just actually atrocious. But if you listen to some takes of Kenny G playing, he's not that bad of a player. And this is why I encourage you at the end of the day to come to your own conclusion on whether or not you like the man or not. At least whether or not you like his playing. Because when I was younger, I didn't know anything about Kenny G other than he looked like the guy from SpongeBob. It was only in high school where I put the pieces that Kenny G was bad because my band director had told me so. And being an impressionable student, I just took that as face value. I was like, all right, yeah, Kenny G is the worst musician in the world, gotta be. And then I got into college and I studied music, and that sentiment was passed on even further and it was reinforced even further. And then in graduate school, same thing happened until one day I was taking a jazz history class and we got to the section about smooth jazz. And in this book, he was slamming on smooth jazz. This is the exact quote. There are many things to dislike about smooth jazz. For example, its use of some of the worst aspects of pop recording. The target audience was the money demographic, ages 25 to 54, adults who had graduated from rock to a less abrasive style, but were still shy of embracing jazz. And that's when I was like, is this all just propaganda? Because I've gone all of these years hating on this man, saying that his music is trash, saying that you shouldn't listen to him, saying that he doesn't know how to play, can't swing, can't do all this stuff. And I had never even taken the second to listen to this man's music. That's insane. How can you possibly come to a conclusion on whether or not you like somebody's playing if you don't even listen to their music? So what I did is that day I went home and I listened to like 3 straight albums of Kenny G, and I was like, man, he's not swinging. He's not swinging. Don't get me wrong. He ain't swinging, but it's pretty good. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because me personally, I love me some 80s R&B and pop. So his music was naturally going to resonate with me. And listen, he's not going to dethrone Roy Hargrove as my favorite jazz musician of all time. But I'm definitely not going to go around saying that I hate listening to Kenny G more than I hate listening to Ornette Coleman. Sue me. But it was this sentiment that sparked a massive debate throughout the entire music department. There were people on both sides of the argument, pro Kenny G, anti Kenny G, and the commonality between everybody is that nobody listened to his music. There were a couple people who did listen to music, and most of them said that they liked it. And then everybody else was just like, nah, he's bad. He's bad. I don't like him. He's bad. He's trash. Doc said he's trash. You're gonna listen to Doc? Like, come on, bro. And then there were others who would say, I don't need to form an opinion. Pat Metheny already formed their opinion. And this is what I gotta say to those people. If you're gonna let Pat Metheny form your opinion on whether or not you should include Kenny G in the jazz idiom, I'm just gonna use this quote because this is a direct Pat Metheny quote, okay? If we examine the way he plays, especially if one can remove the actual improvising from the often mundane background environment that it is delivered in, we see that his saxophone style is clearly in the tradition of the kind of playing that most reasonably objective listeners would normally quantify as being jazz. It's just that as jazz, or even as music in a general sense with these standards in mind, it is simply not up to the level of playing that we historically associate with professional improvising musicians. So lately, I have been advocating that we go ahead and include it under the word jazz, since pretty much the rest of the world outside of the jazz community does anyway, and let the chips fall where they may. So listen, you love Kenny G, you hate Kenny G, you don't think that he is a jazz musician, you think he is a jazz musician. That's not up to me, that's up to you. I say listen to his music, come up to your own conclusions, and then hate on him if you still want to hate on him. But if you haven't even taken the chance to listen to his music, I don't know what to tell you. I'm Cameron Coffey. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'm sure people are going to have opinions on this. People might not even watch the video. I'm pretty sure that people are going to click off because I'm a Kenny G defender. I'm a Kenny G defender. I admit it. Unless he does something bad. Unless he does, then I'm not a Kenny G defender. But until then, he's swinging, bro. Kenny G swinging. Sue me. Kenny G. That's going to be the clip. Kenny G is swinging. You can't tell me otherwise. Anyway, have a good rest of your day.